So hopefully you were successful in completing the last two experiments, but we're just going to run through them really briefly to make sure you understood. So this one, the fruit flies, is one of my favorites. And you've seen this, right, from Jurassic Park and all of these movies about the Jurassic time, that the insects were just gigantic. So why are they so big? Well, this scientist, Dr. Clock, was looking at oxygen proportions in the atmosphere and noticing that oxygen was much higher in the atmosphere. Bugs were much bigger. So this is sort of looking at a correlation, but you can come up with a hypothesis that maybe the extra oxygen in the atmosphere leads to bigger bugs. So that's what you should come up with there. And that's indeed what they came up with, that the increase in oxygen, so they call it hyperoxic conditions, led to larger insects. So how would you design an experiment? Well, we would just grow insects at lower levels of oxygen up to higher levels of oxygen and see if their size increases. And you might think, well, gosh, is that enough time for that increase to actually take place? Well, we'll find out. So that's what they did, right? They separated fruit flies into multiple lines, and they raised half of them in regular conditions like we have today, and half of them in hyperoxic conditions, so more oxygen in the atmosphere. And they ran them for 7 generations. And then the 8th generation, they grew them all at normal conditions. So it was kind of their control to see what would happen. And then they weighed them. So what results would support their hypothesis? Well, we should see bigger bugs with more oxygen. So here's a great graph. Let's take a look at this graph. So again, let's identify our axes. So this graph is showing males. This graph is showing females. And then our independent variable, whether it was normal or hyperoxic, is actually displayed in 2 different colors of graphs on the x-axis. So again, your x-axis is usually the independent variable. And it is, in this case, we have regular conditions, hyperoxic conditions, regular conditions, hyperoxic conditions. And then the y-axis is your dependent variable, so how big the insects get. So red is when they have extra oxygen, green is when they don't. And you can see both males and females were much larger when there's more oxygen in the environment. You can see, though, in males, it doesn't affect them quite as much as it does in females, which is interesting. Okay, and so their conclusion that yes, more oxygen in the atmosphere grows bigger bugs, which is kind of cool. Lots of additional questions you could ask. How big can we get them? Does this work for all bugs and not just fruit flies? Could we get a beetle that's like this big? So, all right, and then the next one is the primitive Earth atmosphere. So we know what the primitive Earth atmosphere was made of, and no organic materials, and yet we get organic materials, meaning materials like carbon-based materials that would make up life forms. And so the hypothesis is that, why do we have organic material coming out of this atmosphere? Well, it must be that this atmosphere can create organic material. So that would be our answer to our why question. And that's indeed what they suggested, that you can get organic compounds out of this primitive atmosphere. And so what would your experiment look like? Well, let's create varying levels of primitive atmosphere and see if we can get organic molecules out of it. And we're going to recreate what it might have been like. So it's a very famous experiment, Stanley Miller. And they ran this experiment where they made the primitive Earth's atmosphere right here. And then they shocked it to simulate lightning that would have been in the atmosphere at the time. Now, what they're not showing you in this experimental setup is their control, which would have been atmospheric conditions of today, or none of these gases, just nitrogen, different levels. Okay, so but this is the one that mimicked primitive Earth's atmosphere. And so dependent and independent variables, what are we manipulating? Well, we're manipulating the content of the gas in the atmosphere. Okay, and then what are we measuring? What's the dependent variable? Whether or not organic chemicals are dripping out of this. Okay, and so results, well, we hope to get organic material. And indeed they do. They find all kinds of organic compounds coming out of the primitive atmosphere if lightning strikes. So this is actually one of the leading hypotheses for how organic life began. So kind of cool. And then additional questions, how did we go from there? How did we get DNA? How did we get RNA? Those kind of things. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to use a scientific method. Just remember, we always start with an observation. We ask a question, a causal question, so it's always why. Then we answer that question. What are some potential answers to that question? And remember, those potential answers are called hypotheses. And then we design an experiment where we're manipulating just one variable. That's our independent variable that we're manipulating. We measure a dependent variable, and then we can draw our conclusions from from that experiment.